I would first like to introduce to you a woman who you're all familiar with already, who will be moderating this panel, Joanne Martin Braun. She's the Regional Director of Northern California Shambhala. That means all the 10 centers and groups in Shambhala here in Northern California. She's also a senior teacher in Shambhala. So thank you. And our speakers, you've all heard Amy already introduce herself. Again, the director of the Still Quiet Place. And we just heard a lot from her, so thank you for being here. And for those of you who weren't here last night, Sam Himmelstein is the program director of the Mind-Body Awareness Project, works with young people involved in the juvenile justice system, speaks nationally and internationally on topics related to working clinically with youth. So thanks for being back, Sam. And we'd like to welcome today Meena Srinivasan. She wasn't here last night, but she joins us today. And she's part of the social emotional learning and leadership team for the Oakland Unified School District. She's also a national board certified teacher, and she was the leader in India's mindfulness and education movement. So she's taught mindfulness to 6th through 12th graders in Brazil, India, and California. So thank you for being here, Meena. And finally, Reese Sweeney-Taylor, who is program director for Squash Drive and a student of Shambhala Buddhism. He works teaching mindfulness and meditation to people of all ages. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you. I'd also like to say that we could have all of our presenters up here, every single panel, because they have so much to say. So I'd like to also say that we're trying to keep the panels a little bit small in terms of how many people are sitting up here talking. But I also want to acknowledge Gail Young, John Redger, and Ida Oberman are here. You heard from John and Ida last night, and there'll be more opportunity to hear from them as well. And I'm hoping as we go along with these panels, as you all are addressing things, that if you have particular things that you want to say, that you'll also speak up. Meena, because we didn't have an opportunity last night, I wonder if you could just say a few words about what you're doing and just introduce a little bit more about your work right now.
Let me see if I can everyone hear me? All right, not too loud? All right. So I work for the Oakland Unified School District's Social Emotional Learning and Leadership Development team. And before that, I was a classroom teacher for 10 years, grades 6 through 12. And Oakland is one of 8 school districts in the United States that are working in partnership with an organization called CASEL. CASEL, some of you may have heard about it. It's called the Collaborative, or CASEL stands for Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning. And we're one of 8 large urban districts that are really in emerging work around how do we implement social emotional learning throughout the district? How can we implement policy? And the work is in its early stages. I was hired in September really because of my experience embedding social emotional learning into my classroom practice. And my work now, I was just telling Sam, hasn't really been with outside service providers, but it's been focused on adult practice. So our theory of action in Oakland really focuses on the social emotional learning practice of adults. And when adults practice social emotional learning, they're then able to effectively model and explicitly teach social emotional learning to their students. And it's really important for us to focus on the adult practice, because if we go in and implement a program, but we're not having the larger conversation around what our operating system is and how we're going about doing things, then it's just a Band-Aid. So really, it's at the level of system-wide transformation that we're trying to do this work, with the aim that social emotional learning is the operating system. So to just give you an example of what some of my work looks like, just last Thursday, I was leading a professional learning for about an hour and a half with all of the principals, so 16 principals in Oakland Unified, challenging bunch. Definitely not the same as teaching sixth graders how to breathe mindfully, but it was focused on how to work with with resistance. So how do principals use social emotional learning and mindfulness to work skillfully with resistance, especially when they're being tasked to implement policies that they feel internal resistance to. And I give that example because as we go into this work of bringing mindfulness, bringing social emotional learning into public education, it's really important that what we do is incredibly relevant to the people we're working with. Because if I went in there and I was like, all right, we're going to do a body scan, we're going to do mindful breathing, and these principals are so busy. And it was really important for me to present them with something that they could really relate to and embed the mindfulness through my teaching of that. So that's just a little snapshot of what's happening in Oakland, and I'd be happy to be a thought partner with any of you around this work. My specific role is I'm the middle school and high school program manager, so kind of the point person for the implementation of social emotional learning throughout all of our middle schools and high schools. So pretty intense job, but definitely would love to talk to any of you more about it when there's some time during a break or so. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mia. So our panel is really, this last panel of our morning is to address the idea of training and to go a little bit deeper into training. Something that almost all of you have mentioned at some point in what you've said is about the importance of our own personal training. Amy was bringing that up again this morning. So I wanted to start the questioning off with just asking if you would each say a little bit about your own personal training in terms of mindfulness. And also, we haven't used this word, and maybe this is one of those sticky words again, but one of those words is compassion training. If you might just address a little bit, each one of you.
Well, I like to think of personal training in sort of two major ways. One would be a daily practice, and then one would be carving out time, usually during the summers when you can do a longer and deeper retreat. And I think it's really helpful to think about our personal practice as fundamental as we would think about nourishing the body. So just like we think about having a good breakfast being critical to being successful through the workday, I really value the time that I'm able to take in the morning to set my intention for the day and to have a clear view of what I'm aspiring to, as well as have some time to meditate and settle my mind. And then also, just as important as that, is checking in the evening. In my work with youth, there can be all sorts of really challenging situations that come up during the course of the day, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and a lot of internal trauma can take place through the challenges of discipline and working with all sorts of difficult situations. So in the evening, I find it really important to have a time to self-reflect and process whatever took place during the day, and what I can learn from it. And then during the summers, I really have been making sure that I find time for longer retreats, which give me that much more energy for the coming school year.
Whatever. Does anyone else want to? Just Joanne, do you want to talk about like trainings that we've done or our personal practice? I just want to clarify what would be.
So a personal practice, I think, is important, but also, you know, if there are, obviously all of you have also had, particular training that you've done that's helped prepare you for this work. And so they may not, both be the same, but if you'd like to address.
Sure. Well, I've been really lucky that my husband's also a practitioner. And so we begin our mornings together sitting, which is really important for me to kind of set an intention for the day. And this past year, making this huge leap from being a classroom teacher, where I feel like I found all these creative ways to practice during the day, to now working in central office, which is, it's very different. I've been experimenting with different ways to practice during the day. At the start of every meeting in my unit, we all take time to practice mindful breathing and oftentimes set intentions together, which has been really wonderful. But again, in order to be able to do that, we had to really develop trust with each other, to be able to practice in a group. And, you know, throughout the day, going to the bathroom is a great time to practice mindfulness. It gets you right back in your body. So when I was living in India, I would always tell the teachers I work with there about the 3 T's, which was like toilet time, transitional time, and tea time, because chai is a big part of our of the day there. But similarly for me, I really try to practice the 3 T's when I'm waiting in line, waiting to make photocopies during the day, to come back to my breathing, and also whenever I'm drinking, if it's possible, to also take a mindful meal during the day. When I was in the classroom and I had a prep period, when I had a prep period and someone was using my classroom, I would actually take mindful walks in the neighborhood for, even if it was just 10 minutes, to come back to myself. So I think finding time throughout the day to come back into our bodies, it's just a matter of being more intentional around it. And yoga has been a big part of my life too for a long time. I grew up with yoga. I was just telling someone who, Lori was telling me she was connected with the Siddha Yoga Foundation, and my neighbors growing up were a part of that. So we would do yoga all the time, and that's been a really big and important part of my life. So, yeah. And at night, too, my husband and I like to end our evenings with a practice whenever that's possible.
Well, I echo what the previous 2 panelists are saying about just daily practice and retreat practice. I think they both have a very big role in me being able to do my job the way I'm able to do it. The example, the last question from last night, where the person asked me about dealing with kids who you can't reach, or resistance and stuff like that. You know, my ability to be skillful when something happens like that rests on the shoulders of my ability to be present with myself, to understand what's going on with myself in the moment. So everything turns into a practice for me when I go into the room and work with some incarcerated youth and there's trauma in the room. It's a practice for me to be present to, so that I can be as present as I can be, so that when resistance or protective mechanisms arise, I can send compassion their way instead of taking it personal or something like that, you know. I also, you know, I really believe in meditating, sitting on the cushion. I meditate twice a day as well. I wake up in the morning, I meditate before I go to sleep. Try to get in a retreat a year. Haven't been able to do that because I have a 2-year-old now. And I'm about to have a new baby in a couple of months, so retreat time will take a back seat until they're a little bit older. But I do think it's very, very important, has influenced me to be where I'm at today. And then kind of more just on the formal training, you know, me and I don't know if anybody knows this, but me and John, the other presenter, we went to school together at a graduate school that used to be called the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. It's now renamed as Sophia University. And when we were there, it was a really special place. It's still special now, but we had some real sages and some mystics as teachers and professors. And some of them aren't with us anymore. Some of them has passed on, but a couple of them, we still are in their trainings and have been in their trainings for over 5, 6, 7 years. And although they don't come from the Buddhist tradition or even really use the word mindfulness, they are very present, and they teach us how to be very present. And that along with kind of my Buddhist training through retreats and through meditation centers and stuff like that has enabled me to just consider everything a practice, to make working with young people my spiritual practice. So I'll stop there.
So I think in order not to be redundant, that I'll kind of shift a little bit and say, it can't be overstated how important it is to have a personal practice, and having a personal practice isn't enough. And you have to be applying it in your daily life with your kids, with your spouse, when you're driving, and you definitely have to be applying it in the room when you're with youth. And it's not just applying it, you have to be living it, you have to be demonstrating it most of the time. And when you don't, you have to be honest about that. Like, wow, I just got really reactive. Because that is being mindful, but again, I think there's this distortion of what we think it looks like. And really, for me, being mindful means being real in the moment. The other thing I wanted to touch on is the broader topic of training, because there are a lot of trainings out there. And again, you want to look at what calls to you. You want to look at what they're asking of you to have when you come in, and who your classmates are going to be. You want to look at what they say they're offering and get a feel for whether that's the case or not. And you really want to think about, and some of these you're not going to know off at the beginning, but you want to do your best to kind of match what you're getting trained in to what you feel you want to do. So if you want to work with incarcerated youth, go train with Sam, and if you want to work with kindergartners, go train with Leslie Grant in Marin. I mean, be clear, you're as the best as possible, your starting age group, your starting setting, what you bring, what I like to call your learning edge, like what you're developing, what's hard for you when you're working with youth, so that you're getting, you're expanding your skill set. But those are the kinds of things that when you start to look at all the offerings that are out there, those are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about in terms of specific trainings for working with youth.
Right. Thank you, Amy. And that's a great segue into the next part of this, which is about training that's available. And I think we know that some people begin working this way from their own individual path, and maybe they had a particular job, and bringing those things, so that training programs aren't necessarily always the path that people take. But that I wanted to also see, I know several of you have training programs, and so I thought maybe we could just, if you could say, maybe start off and say a little bit more about the training program you do and what you're trying to accomplish with it, and then we can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I mean, the primary thing that I offer is a 10-week online course, which is great because you can do it from your bedroom in your jammies. But the other thing that's really awesome about it is that it always has people from all over the world. So this, I think this one might have won the prize. Now, I have someone from Qatar, which among other things raises all sorts of issues because you think we're restricted here and what we can say. So she has to be very, very subtle. But, it's people around the world and different settings, different ages. And I think for me, the things that I feel might distinguish it for somebody are, I do have people do a written application that talks about what's your personal practice, what's your experience with youth, what is your learning edge, what are your intentions. So the people who come in, for the most part, also have really solid practice and a depth of practice, and so they learn from each other. I learn from them. I think it's really valuable. Occasionally I will take someone because they're already teaching to youth and they have no practice, and I'm hoping to give them what I fondly call the oh shit moment of like, maybe I really need a practice before I keep doing this. So if they're out there in the world and they don't have much practice, but they think they're teaching mindfulness, sometimes I'll bring them in because then they learn like, yeah, maybe I need a little bit more support or something. And I think the other thing for me is that I really have worked with youth from age 3 to undergrads, and really I've worked from age 3 to 93. So it's a pretty broad program, and you can scale it from, for the little ones or the older ones. And I have worked, with the exception of incarcerated youth, I've worked in pretty much every setting imaginable, from, schools where everybody's on free lunch and all the parents speak Spanish. The kids usually speak English or mostly speak English. And definitely the kids that I hope are not going to end up with Sam. Sorry, Sam, but I want to put you out of business. To, the other end of the spectrum, so very affluent youth who are stressed because they have to get into a particular college and be the captain of the soccer team. And I've worked the whole spectrum, and so I just bring a wide range of experience to the training. And then the group members definitely bring their own experience and expertise, and that's a really valuable part of it.
Sam, do you want to say something?
Sure. I'm also trying to put myself out of business.
I know you are. I know you are.
Let's see. So at MBA, we do trainings at MBA. We don't have any scheduled yet, but there will be some. But like Amy was saying, we're very specialized. I mean, we serve young people who nobody else wants to work with, to be honest with you. Kids who are incarcerated, kids who are in high schools that are continuation schools and have a lot of probation kids. Like I was saying last night, these are oftentimes the perpetuators of violence in the community. And a lot of stuff comes up when working with them, inner judgments, how to work with resistance, how to connect authentically, some of these soft skills that is everything else besides how to teach mindfulness of the breath. But of course we go over that too. So MBA, that's what MBA focuses on. We really, we have trainings like mindfulness-based interventions with high-risk adolescents and stuff like that. And I'm also going to be offering a training probably sometime in the fall of 2014 that focuses on mindfulness-based substance abuse treatment for the same population. Are we supposed to just be talking about our own trainings or just other stuff too?
Well, both. I mean,
Okay.
say whatever you'd like to share in terms of
Yeah.
if there's other things that you also respect that are out there, and what you've done that's been helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I really think what Amy does is really positive because she has an application process, and I think that's really important. I know some other, somebody threw around the name Mindful Schools last night. They're definitely out there. They do online stuff. It's a little bit more if you're just into the either just general mindfulness or the mindfulness and education kind of field, broadly defined. A lot of those guys used to work with MBA, so we know them pretty well. And I can't think of anything else on specifically the mindfulness and education piece, but there's a lot of great centers like this, like Shambhala, like the East Bay Meditation Center, that offer obviously more Dharma, Buddhist-based trainings, but they're also can be very high quality too. I think it's important to take into account what Amy said. What is your intention? Who do you want to work with? And then start to kind of script the trainings you go after based on that. So.
Thank you. Mina, do you want to say anything about Thich Nhat Hanh's training and your own, thoughts about other training out there?
Definitely. So I first got connected with the whole mindfulness and education world in India. And it happened because Thich Nhat Hanh was there, and believe it or not, I didn't even really know who he was. And in India, there's so many teachers that Thich Nhat Hanh doesn't seem like a really important person. So, and I was going through a particularly stressful time as a classroom teacher at a demanding international school, and really felt just transformed by his presence and his teachings, and had a spiritual practice definitely before then, but just the accessibility and the practicalness of being able to apply the practice immediately to myself in the moment was revolutionary for me. And that particular, he held a retreat in India, and it was actually the first retreat he held for educators. And as you can imagine, mindfulness in India is going to be a little different in terms of context. And it's not like you need to talk about neuroplasticity a lot. You can really focus on the practice, and people do feel a connection to their spiritual heritage. I believe even in the state of Maharashtra that teachers can get paid leave to do a Goenka Vipassana retreat. So it's just a very different space to be doing this kind of work. And really from that first retreat that Thich Nhat Hanh held for about 500 educators, there has been a movement was called Applied Ethics, that's now called Wake Up Schools. And they're in the process of developing and piloting some curriculum. And some of you may have known he held a huge retreat this past summer with more than 1,000 educators in Canada, and also previously in London. And so I've been very active in the Thich Nhat Hanh community's secular application of mindfulness. And of course, when I say that, it's always a little interesting because it's the secular application of mindfulness taught by Thich Nhat Hanh, you know. And so I think it's really important to understand that similar to what Amy said before, it's the practice and being skillful with your use of language. And in the Plum Village tradition, in the way in which they're presenting it to schools, it is very secularized. I've found great benefit in connecting with a mindfulness practice first in the Buddhist tradition, and I actually had no intentions of coming back to the States. I'm American born, but had been living in India for 5 years, and my mom got very sick, which is what brought me back to the States. And in knowing that I'd be making this transition back to the States, I connected with Amy and connected with a lot of leaders here in the field, because it is really important to understand, when you've been trained in that Buddhist context, how to present it in a secular setting. And so I remember meeting Amy, however many years ago, but really benefiting from her guidance and the guidance of a lot of other people who are kind of leaders in the field stateside. I do think that the Wake Up Schools initiative is great because it does give you, your first experience is really in a retreat setting, and I think everyone spoke about the importance of having retreat time as part of training. And I also think that it could be beneficial to engage in a training like Amy's, or there's a lot of great stuff out there I myself went through the mindfulness, the Center for Mindfulness at UMass training also afterwards to supplement kind of the more Buddhist practice.
Joanne, before Reese goes, can I say two things? I want to make sure that we're not confusing something. Lately, it seems in some places that I've been that secular is being interpreted as ethicsless, and I don't feel that that's an accurate interpretation of that word. And I think we need to be careful when we're teaching mindfulness, to maintain the ethical foundations of it. And then, Mina, I'm just going to give it back to you because you have a book and you have a new book, so you might want to say something about that.
Thank you. See, this is why Amy's a good friend and mentor. And so there's a book that I helped contribute to that has so many wonderful practices. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called Planting Seeds, And it's written by Thich Nhat Hanh and the Plum Village Global Community. And that book was really born out of this first retreat that happened in India. So I got to be a part of kind of bringing that to life. And while I was in India, and when I came back to the States in my first year of teaching back in the States, I'd kept a blog called like A Year of Mindfulness in the Classroom. And that blog is now a book. That'll be coming out. It's called Teach, Breathe, Learn, and it includes lessons that I shared with my students, but that's the third part of the book. The first two parts of the book really focus on how to cultivate practice as a school teacher, like when you barely have time to pee during the school day, like how do you practice? You know, when you have tons of papers to grade, how do you practice? When you have a really difficult parent, you know, conference coming up, how do you practice? So really just building on kind of my personal experiences in the classroom is what that book's about. And it'll be out in September from Parallax. Thank you.
Thanks, Mina. And I think that that's, you know, what you're bringing up, Amy, about it's, you know, the ethics are still an incredibly important part of it. And also that at times it is inspired by a teacher, and the teacher's presence is very much still in that, even if the way that the presentation is secular. So it can kind of be both. It can kind of come from different perspectives, I think. And Reese, I wonder, some of your beginnings I know were also like Mina's, but you were took a job that then you started to be inspired about bringing that in more. And I wonder if you might say something.
Well, first of all, I've drawn from planting seeds in some of my work, so thank you, Mina. It's an honor to be sitting here. So I would just like to emphasize the compassion component, that mindfulness is critical, and it's very important that we focus on that. But we can, sort of what that word can denote is, it can be a bit of like a cold or clinical view of the world sometimes, I find. And so when I'm really just focused on my mindfulness practice, sometimes I notice I'm not actually necessarily connecting with my students as much as I would like. And what's been really important for me is also incorporating some sort of compassion practice, which I find is what actually allows me to connect with the kids in a much more direct way. And students are really looking for warmth, they're looking for understanding, and that part is very critical. So that's been helpful in my own path.
Right. Thank you. And I'm wondering, Ida or John, or I think Gail is back there. Gail's going to have more opportunity to talk a little bit about the kind of diversity training that she does, but I wonder if either of you have something that you'd like to say about training, what you've noticed, what you do.
Well, I came to teaching mindfulness in the classroom, just trying to figure out how to get people who are from diverse backgrounds to talk with each other and not to increase their stereotypes. And so I'm going to give you this. So I had been working some in the 80s at the Berkeley Psychic Institute, so there was some sense of chakra, and been doing some yoga. But then I started working with John Wellwood as a client and a student, and was turned on to my 20-year, will continue more than 20-year association with him and his methods, and also to Jen Lin's work on focusing. So I became very clear and worked with how to do that. And then as the Shambhala practice deepened, that started in 1990, as I became more comfortable and became a certified meditation instructor, I became more out with a mindfulness base. And prior to that, I would do mindfulness, but I actually explained it, going back to what Amy talked about earlier today. I explained it from, I said, yes, this comes from both the East and the West, and I would use Langer's work. She was one of the first philosophers to come out and really look at mindfulness. So I just grounded it in Western philosophy, and the students were very much game to do it. But I couldn't do this without my own practice, my daily practice and my retreat practice. You can't hold the container. If if you don't practice. So, yeah, thank you.
Yes, Langer, Langer. I'm blanking for a second. Ellen. And then, of course, the emotional intelligence.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for what went before me. I will echo what was said in terms of personal practice. I can only reiterate, I myself have done a Datun, which is a month silent retreat. And out of that really grew the decision to start the school and have a daily morning practice. Hannah and I, in our our duet, I had the chance to reflect on, as we build mindfulness in schools, in our school, to be culturally open and respectful, and we are really in dialogue with our staff who are not from who are from various different backgrounds, and not Buddhist and not anthroposophists, and to really think hard about how to frame it so it doesn't feel like a white fancy feature. And it's a very steep learning curve for us, and actually our students teach us, because as we do our mindful practice and have our students explain to our guests when they are the docents, that's when we learn the language. Thank you.
Yeah, again, echoing the importance of personal practice, I think that everything rests upon that as a strong foundation. And also what's really important to me is to have a mentor that I work closely with, especially in the yoga world where I teach. I try to identify a senior teacher who's been teaching way longer than me and practicing way longer than me, and I resonate with the things that they're saying and the things that they're doing, so I'll go and assist their classes, and I study them very closely and try to figure out what it is that they're doing, and then I'll ask them questions that I have about why they said a certain thing or did a certain thing. And also something that hasn't been mentioned that has been a great sort of help for me as I watch YouTube videos extensively of other teachers and other Dharma talks, so people that I don't have the opportunity to be with in person. I watch their lectures and pick up on a lot of their teachings, and I try to also listen to as many guided meditations as I can from across as many different teachers. So I pick up on different ways of languaging things and different ways of understanding things, and also reading extensively. And I try to look across different disciplines to kind of pull knowledge from other fields that seemingly wouldn't fit into this work, but then bring it in and kind of advance my understanding that way as well. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add, and from our point of view, a resource that we found very helpful is Rudolf Steiner College has something called the course for public school teachers, and because we so see Waldorf education as grounded in mindfulness, and it really is the mindfulness as incarnated in the arts, the teachers have a whole 2 weeks to experience themselves as being present, as artists, as creators, as compassionate colleagues. It is as everything, still not reflective of our community, so we are locally building an urban public Waldorf training with focus on equity, but that's still under design. Thank you.
So we have about 5 more minutes before we're going to break for lunch, obviously the presenters will be around, and there'll be some opportunities to talk with them a little more and ask some questions, and we'll also have further presentations and opportunities in this afternoon. But I wonder if we just have maybe a couple of questions that people would like to ask.
Mina, would you be willing to briefly say what you did with those 50 principles in an hour and a half? Just kind of a summary. I'm just really curious and excited to hear about that.
Yeah.
And I think other people might be too.
Well, a lot of what I use is actually, because my office is social emotional learning and leadership development. And I'd be happy to share, my cards are out there, some of the resources, but it was on 3 levels of resistance and how to work with various levels that might come your way. So the first is resistance you might have when people have a lack of information. So when all of a sudden they're being told, oh, you need to implement this, but there's no information around it. And I gave various strategies on how to work with the different levels. And the third level is actually the most challenging, and I think we're going to get a chance to explore it a little more in the afternoon, but it's around oppression, and it's around things that are very complex, and especially in Oakland and our demographics there. And being a person of color, you know, I experience this to some degree too, but just around assumptions and perspectives, and it was on how we can, the importance of being vulnerable as a leader in those spaces, and naming when you feel uncomfortable, and naming when you don't know something, and also acknowledging how scary certain things might be for your staff. And so in that is really a lot of the mindfulness, right? Because the awareness of what we're feeling and the acknowledgement of what we're feeling. So we did a little practice of looking at data, and our data in Oakland is kind of scary, just around graduation rate, and also in looking at what's coming up for us, what feelings are coming up for us when we're looking at data, and just spending time authentically sharing around that, because so often we go into solution mode and we're not really being present with what we're feeling, and because of that, we're not creating space to have authentic dialogue around like intention, why we're doing this work. So email me and I can share a little more. It was a 90-minute professional learning, but that's just some highlights.
Can I add one thing? Sam heard me say this in Canada at some point, but I have concern when we're talking about resistance with youth. I'm just kind of segueing for a minute. And I think we need to be really careful, because there's ways where for youth, especially in their teen years, that's developmentally appropriate, it's healthy, and often what we're calling their resistance just means that it's not going the way we want it to go. And so the person really who's being resistant is us. And I think we need to be really responsible, and I think the way that ties into what Mina's saying is we start to do that when we get uncomfortable. And this, I mean, in tying the whole thing together, this comes back to our own practice, and it's like, ooh, I'm uncomfortable with how that student just responded to me. I'm starting to label them as resistant. Time to take a breath, time to look at what I'm resisting in them. I mean, and that's layers and layers and layers of practice, and it all needs to be accessible to you in that moment.
Okay, so the message I'm getting really strongly is that I need to increase my practice. And I need to start with a retreat. And when you Google that, you come up with a million hits. And so if you can just address, something, what am I looking for when I'm looking for a retreat? What can I find to help me just get this information that I need and deepen this in the way that I need to?
Well, let's start with some basics. Let's make it, instead of making it so big, let's make it kind of easy. So I will say that I am also a parent, so my retreat practice is profoundly restricted by when my child and children are at camp. So the first big cut happens that the retreat has to happen the week of July 7th. I mean, let's just make it really real. So it's like your calendar, are you getting on a plane or not? is it affordable? And then I think to me the biggest thing is what are you looking for and who's teaching? Like, and this goes back to what John was saying about mentors, like the depth of the practice that the person has. And there are certain places like here or Spirit Rock or other places where you're pretty much assured that the depth of teaching is going to be solid. And there's other places where there's more of a question mark. And, so the setting and all that stuff, I don't think, what matters is the practice of the teacher or teachers. And, ask around, get advice, look at your calendar, go knowing that you'll get, most of what you need for that moment, and that the next retreat's going to be different and you're going to need something else and get something else the next time around.
Thank you. And it was a great question, by the way. And so I just wanted to mention one other thing about training in schools and some of the things that are happening out there along that category. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Compassionate Cities project, but Mayor Greg Fisher, who is the mayor of Louisville, Kentucky, and another brilliant politician who actually was just here in San Francisco talking about the fact that in politics we almost never use the word compassion, that it's kind of an anathema when it comes to politics, unless we're talking about, compassion towards somebody over there that's not really that connected to me. And one of the things that they did that was really groundbreaking this last year was that he somehow got all the schools in Louisville, whether they were private, parochial, or public, to sign off on a training on compassion that everybody took before the Dalai Lama arrived for a program that he was teaching there, as well as an enormous amount of other fantastic spiritual teachers, including the teacher we're connected with, Sakyong Mipam Rinpoche, and many, many wonderful teachers from all different traditions. And one of the things that was so amazing about this was that he got buy-in from every level for this. And it was so groundbreaking that they are now looking at doing the largest ever mindful training in schools that would be connected with compassion training as well. And if they can pull it off, it'll be quite fantastic because it'll be an entire city. But it's also being brought in every level of government there. So if you want to see some fun YouTube videos, go to Festival of Faiths and you can hear the chief of police talking about it, and some of the people who are on the school board and different people who have their voices who spoke at that. So there are some possible, some amazing ways in which I think this is coming out in different opportunities.
Joanne, I just want to add one quick thing about Louisville is they're actually a model social emotional learning district, and if you Google Louisville, or if you send me an email, I can send you an amazing video about how their superintendent made it a priority and how they really infuse social emotional learning throughout the district. So just wanted to add that.
Oh, great, thanks. That's wonderful. Well, I want to thank you all for the things that you've contributed here, and we will take a lunch break and see you all this afternoon. I also want, because I know many of you have questions and important things, I'd like to invite you, if you'd like to write down a question that you have that you'd like the panel to address. I can't promise that we're going to get to all of them, but where's Nicole? And perhaps give those slips of paper to Nicole. We'll take a look at those and see if we can group some of the questions. Our very last panel of the afternoon will have all of our presenters, and so it would be lovely if we had more of your questions that we can sort of bring together for that.